Hi, everyone. This is Pranitha Gupta at the Center for Law and Social Policy, CLASP. On behalf of CLASP and my colleague Janice Fine at the Rutgers Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, I want to welcome you to our first webinar of 2018. I also want to take a quick moment to introduce CLASP's new Job Quality Senior Policy Analyst, Tanya Goldman, who joins us after a distinguished career at the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, and I hope you all get a chance to connect with her very soon. On today's webinar, our terrific presenters will share a case study of how they have used strategic co-enforcement in the residential care industry. This is a timely and important topic, and we have over 100 people participating in today's call from 11 states, 13 cities and counties, and over 20 organizations. Some key logistics before we get started. We hope that you'll ask many questions. However, given the volume of people participating in today's call, we ask that you submit a written question by typing it into the question box as indicated in this slide. This call is being recorded by CLASP, so you may hear some beeps, but we ask that no one else record this call. With that, I invite Janice to provide an overview of co-enforcement. Thanks, everyone. Janice?
Hi, everyone. We're so excited about today's webinar. Thanks, Pranitha. So we'll just pick things up right where we started off, last time. Next slide, please. Where we talked about strategic enforcement, and we heard a lot from David Weil and from the other presenters about the importance of targeting outreach and investigations where evidence shows labor law violations are the greatest, in industries where workers are most likely to be cheated out of their wages and where they're least likely to speak up and report such violations. Next slide, please. And the idea that what we really need to do is create ripple effects and focus on raising compliance across a sector and an industry, that we want to increase the cost of non-compliance by using all our enforcement tools, by identifying formal and informal networks in which employers are embedded, including moving up the chain and supply chains, and publicizing repeat violators. Next slide, please. So today, we're going to talk about strategic co-enforcement. And the idea here is that for strategic enforcement to fulfill its promise, workers and worker organizations and high road firms have to play a central role. And this is not only because there aren't enough inspectors, although that's undoubtedly the case, it's because there'll never be enough investigators. Workers and worker and community organizations and firms will always know things that government simply won't. Next slide. So let's just look at each party. Workers have a presence at the work site every single day. So they're fully aware of the actual conditions of work because they live them. They know what employer practices are regarding clocking in and out and hours worked, payment and employment practices, how many workers are actually employed, even if some don't appear on the formal payroll, the parties that are actually supervising the work, contractors, joint employers, etc. They note changes in employer behavior over time, and they have relationships with other workers. So it's really important to understand the unique role that workers play when we think about enforcement. Next slide, please. And then we need to think about worker and community organizations and also the contributions that they make. If they're strong organizations, they have relationships with workers and trust of workers. This gives them important access to information that government needs in order to do the enforcement. Often they have language capacity, availability beyond 9 to 5. And frequently in my own research, I find that these organizations are deep sources of expertise on industries and employer schemes. They have the ability to build and strengthen cases and expand complainants. They have the ability to cast the issue in moral terms and mobilize support for agencies when agencies are under attack. They can act as a countervailing power to employers, and they are an enduring presence to monitor compliance. Next slide, please. So here's just a little diagram to kind of give you a sense that that organizations can participate all through the life of a case, from the beginning where they're doing outreach and education to workers and employers, to identifying cases and expanding cases, making them stronger, bringing more complainants in, engaging in home visits and that kind of work, And then providing support during investigations by setting up meetings for investigators, continuing to conduct research and pass information along to investigators, including payroll reconstruction, et cetera. And they can play a role in the settlement, ensuring that workers know the terms, that they receive their payments, that they're being communicated with and updated all the way along through a case. And finally, they can play a role in compliance monitoring, ensuring through regular communication with employees that employers are complying with what they agreed to do. Next slide, please. So I'll just say that in my experience, I've studied co-enforcement in Seattle and in San Francisco, in LA, and county and city, and in California, and talked with many of you, many agencies all across the country about their relationships with organizations. And here's what I hear over and over and over again. Agencies are looking for good leads and solid cases. They're looking for a way to preserve confidentiality. That's a huge focus of theirs. They need to respect the procedures and the processes, and they need to work with partners who understand that they need to do that. They are navigating often complicated politics between their own agency and either the governor or the mayor or the city council or the legislature. They need to feel that they can trust the organizations that they're working with, that they won't be publicly shamed, but that there'll be an opportunity to invest in the relationship and to communicate privately about issues and problems that come up. Now, for organizations, they need to focus on preserving the trust of workers, even at the expense of cases. The most important thing is that workers feel that they can tell the organization what's really going on and not be at risk. The second is they have a need for information sharing to preserve credibility. So they need agencies to keep them in the loop so that they can keep workers updated about the progress of the case. They need, if there's financial support involved, they need to have practical and financially sustainable contracts that make it possible for them to plan and carry out their broader work. They need reasonable reporting requirements, and they need to be able to talk about the work of their own organization as they conduct the outreach that they're being contracted to conduct on behalf of an agency. Last slide, please. So I'll just say that in my experience of studying these agencies, I would say there's a real contrast between thin co-enforcement implementation and thick co-enforcement implementation. Often thin is when the agency only sees the organization as a resource for kind of retail door-to-door outreach in business districts, or when an agency says that the organization can only distribute material that the agency gives them, or when the organization is not given any role during the complaint, investigation, or settlement or monitoring processes. The contracts are very short-term for very specific tasks, small amounts of money, and sometimes require reporting, excessive reporting. Now, thick co-enforcement is a recognition of the broad, long-term work that an organization and an agency can do together, not just tactic by tactic, but seeing this partnership as a strategy and seeing the organization and all of the possibilities that it has to offer in terms of participating. So longer term contract for outreach, education, training, and investigatory support, allowing the organization to integrate their work into the organization's program, and where the agency tries to share as much information as possible. So with that, I'd like to move on now to an in-depth discussion of the California Strategic Enforcement Partnership. We'll begin with Youngsun Park. She's the Special Assistant to the California Labor Commissioner. Youngsun has been with the agency for the last 5 years, and before that was a longtime litigator at an Asian American civil rights organization for 8 years. Youngsun?
Thank you, Janice. Good morning, everyone. I will be providing some background on the strategic partnership model that we have in place in California, and we really do hope that we can be a resource to other entities that are interested in developing a similar model or are taking any of our tools. So please feel free to reach out to me following this webinar. Next slide, please. Under our current leadership of California Labor Commissioner Julie Su, our agency has truly embraced community partnership, specifically in the context of our field enforcement unit, which is known as BOFI, the Bureau of Field Enforcement, and that is our investigatory arm that has the statutory right to enter any workplace in California, inspect for violations, and issue citations. But what we have done more recently is created more of an organizational infrastructure and protocols to support this partnership work. It's been more formalized, and I hope to share some of that with you today. But even before we formalized this work, many of our most successful cases historically were in partnership with worker advocacy organizations, and that really paved the path for formalizing the model that we have in place today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about who our partners are. They're worker centers, industry watchdogs, civil rights, and legal service organizations. And I've listed some of them here. And I do think it's important to say that we don't necessarily have contracts with organizations, but these organizations, many of them listed here, do receive funding from a private foundation, the James Irvine Foundation here in California. And that has really enabled us to work on capacity building, both internally on our agency side, as well as on the organizational side. And that funding has also allowed us to have more meaningful relationship building opportunities through meetings, retreats, and other training opportunities. So I know there are some funders on the call today, and I just do want to really emphasize the valuable role that funding has played in promoting a broader agenda of social and economic justice, but specifically fighting wage theft and supporting a community role in public enforcement efforts. Next slide, please. All of the organizations and our internal staff have been organized into industry-based teams. So we have these 6 focus areas where we've taken kind of the special interests and the skills of different organizations and staff and match them up so that they can be very focused in developing strategy and looking at high impact cases in these 6 industries where wage theft is very prevalent. Next slide, please. So in these investigation cases, the role of community partners is really a partnership throughout the entire life of the case, but very much early on when there is a potential case and a potential referral, we lean very heavily on these organizations to identify the cases and do some preliminary investigation and research in order to work up the case. So that can involve initial worker intake, doing some actual crunching of numbers to evaluate violations, wage violations, and then also research on the employer and entities involved in the case. And so once the case becomes activated and assigned internally, then we do partner throughout all stages of investigation, from pre-citation investigation all the way through potentially a citation appeal hearing. But throughout the entire case, I think thematically what we truly value as an agency is the organization's unique ability to support worker participation and broader community efforts to fight wage theft. And so internally, we're always training on worker interviewing skills, but I think most of us are aware that as government officials, there is a barrier oftentimes in worker outreach and communication and interviewing that can really be addressed through work with a more trusted community partner. Next slide, please. I'd like to share internally some of the resources that we have prioritized and committed to these strategic partnership cases. So when we do have a case that has been selected through this strategic partnership in consultation with our community partner, and that is in one of these 6 high priority industry areas, internally, we've committed significant resources to enable further success and greater outcomes in that case. So this is a diagram that shows that internally what we call our BOPI strategy teams, which is how we've assigned staff to these partnership cases, they all can draw on other unit resources within our agency. So these cases, which are generally more complex and have potentially greater wage violations and therefore require more complex investigations, these cases get special priority legal resources. So they get assigned an attorney early on for consultation. Going around the diagram, the judgment enforcement unit that we have, both investigators and attorneys, get involved at the outset of the case to assess collectability and monitor any, fishy activities such as fraudulent transfers. We also evaluate whether it makes sense for some of the workers to file individual wage claims through our administrative process. And then we also have a criminal investigation unit, and we evaluate whether a case is appropriate for a referral to criminal prosecutorial agencies. And then lastly, but definitely one of the most important aspects of our internal alignment, is the prioritization of any retaliation complaints that may surface from these cases. Our RCI unit is prepared to prioritize these cases so that any retaliation that is reported can be addressed as swiftly as possible, which unfortunately still is often not as swift as we'd like, but we're trying to create more of an infrastructure there. So next slide, please. So with that internal commitment of resources, we have these broader partnership goals. What are we trying to achieve? We really want to internally have developed industry-specific enforcement strategies, and I think that speaks to the broader need to have strategic enforcement. Of course, we want to collect unpaid wages, increase worker engagement, and identify these high impact cases and have the broader industry impact. And oftentimes our staff didn't really have the opportunity to take a step back and think at an industry-wide level when they were doing their casework. So this has also been a great training opportunity for our staff to be able to think about higher, broader impact cases beyond just their day-to-day caseload that comes in through our referral system. Next slide, please. So in order to achieve those goals, we've established some case criteria to guide the referral of these cases from our community partners. And this is just some representative case criteria here. We look at the number of workers that are affected and willing to cooperate, the significance of the wage violations, the potential for up-the-chain liability, and that broader industry impact. And then, of course, look at the evidentiary considerations, because we do need to be able to prove the violations and defend them at hearing, and then the collectability. So in light of these significant resources that we're devoting to these cases very early on, we want to evaluate at the outset how likely it is that we can not just issue a high dollar figure citation, but actually recover those wages for the workers. Next slide. So I'm going to go into detail into one of the protocols that we have created, and then I'll pass it on to our case study presenters. So in order to facilitate information sharing in this partnership, we've developed a common interest agreement, which for those of you who have a legal background, you may be familiar with this, but it is a legal doctrine that comes from criminal law, where parties that are not necessarily representing parties that have different interests in that they may not be co-defendants or co-plaintiffs in a civil case, but may have common interests, can enter agreement to be able to share information without waiving all privileges and confidentiality.
I will be right back.
So the common interest agreement is an agreement that we've put in place with each of our community partners that allows for disclosure of some confidential information in order to further the investigation. Next slide. And so these are just two practical benefits of having the common interest agreement in place. One is that information that we would be disclosing in response to a Public Records Act request, we're sharing with community partners without going through those steps of formally requesting the information. So that, of course, saves time and resources. And secondly, the community partners also getting information that would not be available to the public under the Public Records Act for active cases, because we do withhold responses to Public Records Act requests if the case is ongoing. But those are, that's precisely the information that the community partner needs access to in these investigations. And so we do share that information. And I want to note here that in the first instance where information is available through the Public Records Act request, we didn't really need legally this common interest agreement to be able to share the information. But in some cases, it's made our staff more comfortable with sharing, because these are new procedures, and oftentimes it takes, staff feel they need time to adopt the policies and get comfortable with them. So in many ways, information sharing, I think, is about relationship building and trust, so that even if technically or legally you're able to share the information, the staff need to feel comfortable doing that. And so in some instances, the common interest agreement has facilitated that. And the last slide about common interest agreement is, this is just a sampling of the documents that we share under the agreement: inspection reports, worker questionnaires, employer records. So an important exception is if the records were received pursuant to a subpoena. But employer records and worker declarations are also information that can be very helpful in allowing the community partner to assist and support the investigation. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but for now I'll turn it over to our case study presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Youngsun. My name is Emily Mullin. I'm with the Labor Commissioner's Office, the Bureau of Field Enforcement in San Diego, and I have been a Deputy Labor Commissioner for exactly 2 years now. I'm going to talk briefly, along with our partner from Filipino Workers Center, about a case study we recently embarked on together regarding Adat Shalom Boarding Care Incorporated. Next slide. This is just a snippet from our website. We're under the Department of Industrial Relations within the state of California. And as I said, I'm with the Bureau of Field Enforcement, where years prior, it was a fairly thin amount of legislation that allowed us to go out into workplaces and cite for certain labor law violations, but not minimum wage. And in the last few years, under the leadership of our Labor Commissioner, Julie Su, we've gained an incredible amount of enforcement authority, which we'll kind of touch on in this case study. But I will turn it over to Aki Soriano Versosa of the Filipino Workers Center so she can introduce herself.
Hi, and you can turn to the next slide. My name is Aki Soriano Versosa. I'm the Executive Director of the Filipino Workers Center and the Board President of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And we're a workers center that's located in Southern California, historic Filipino town. And we work with and organize primarily with caregivers, Filipino caregivers in the private side of the industry. A lot of them are working one-on-one in individual homes, but there are many that are working in boarding care facilities as well. And we do a lot of comprehensive services, programs, legislative advocacy, as well as these enforcement cases. Next slide.
So in this Adopt Shalom case, we have a brief timeline. In 2016, I was introduced to the idea of these strategic partnerships. And so in early 2017, it was still kind of a nascent idea, and we had started to work with the Filipino Workers Center. Aki was familiar with this company and their business practices from a member of their Workers Center. She introduced the details to us in March, and then we had some months of bureaucratic wrangling, and then in May, thanks to PwC, we were able to interview one of the former employees off-site. That kind of got the ball rolling and piqued our interest. And then in July, we organized a multi-site inspection. There were 6 homes, so we wanted to make sure that we investigated them all at the same time. And then our investigator who was assigned has done an incredible amount of follow-up, auditing, subpoena service, interrogatories, there were depositions, and that all led to a citation being issued at the end of last year. They have appealed the citation, so that is pending a hearing. Next slide, please. So throughout those months, in order to keep the workers engaged and kind of keep PwC on board, we organized monthly calls. If we didn't have any case updates, we still tried to make them productive by talking about our strategic goals, plans for media outreach, etc. We also had our staff with the Bureau of Field Enforcement visit the Workers Center, and that was very eye-opening to see all of the things that they offer to workers in their area. Aki also invited us to a presentation on from the California Domestic Worker Coalition. We had industry-based trainings, a half-day retreat where we met with Hina Shah from Golden Gate University, and that was also very informative. And then the investigator herself was always in touch with the community group, PwC. Next slide, please.
So the role of the community organization, one is that in this partnership, we're able to really bring kind of like the deep connections that we have with workers that we've established in different ways. So outreach and doing education and getting people to begin to realize what their rights are and help really walk them through a process supported in a way that they feel ready to step into actually filing a case and openly coming out to take on the violations against them. And we are also really interested and we really aim at developing the leadership also of these workers, because we really see that transforming these industries is going to take the transformation also of workers to be able to really become educated and active in making sure that the labor laws are a reality in their workplace, that there is dignity in their workplace. So we do leadership development, community organizing, as well as policy advocacy like our California Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, where we're able to end 75 years of exclusion from overtime protections for nannies and caregivers here in California. And now it's about enforcement and making that a reality. And then we also then have all of these different services and programs that help address very immediate issues that folks go through and help us to develop this trusting relationship that really helps eliminate challenges and barriers for workers to be able to stand up for their rights, like immigration services and others, workforce training, for example, as well as community and cultural support. All right, next. So with the pre-inspection, PwC was able to, actually, the case came through an existing member, and and it's not a case that would have gone directly by themselves to the Labor Commissioner's office. So it's something that came through our membership, and then we were able to work together to get these pre-worker interviews, which is key to get to know what really an inspection would be looking for, as well as gain some more support from workers to be willing to really work together on the case. And we combined it with immigration assessments, because a lot of the workers are undocumented, so that we could also see, and we did identify that through the process of this investigation and a previous inspection, that there was a lot of obstruction of justice and possible retaliation that makes them possibly eligible for like U visas, for example. And then we continue throughout the whole investigation and the legal process. It can take a long time, but PwC is able to maintain regular interaction with the workers and regular meetings, so that they are continually engaged and don't feel in the dark also through this process. And they were able to reach out to even more workers as well.
I'll just add, I'll add that because PwC was able to get us contact with these former workers, we had a lot of information to start off with before we even stepped foot at the business. We were able to look up a lot about the owners, their payroll records with our Economic Development Department, Department of Social Service, which does the licensing. So the pre-inspection was quite helpful, and I think really contributed to the success of this case. Next slide, please. This is just a screenshot of their website. It is a board and care home for the elderly. The owner had 6 homes with a capacity of 6 at each, so potentially 36 clients. And I just highlighted where they say they provide 24-hour care, and then some of the types of afflictions that affect the residents, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. A lot of them were non-ambulatory. So it's fairly heavy labor, and there were 2 caregivers typically at a time in each home for up to 6 residents. Next slide. Mm-hmm. So with that information, we knew that we had to go to 6 locations. We wanted to visit them all at once because we did have information from PwC and their contacts that the DOL had visited but had only gone to 1 location, and the owner of the care home had the workers shifted to another location during that inspection to avoid any potential issues arising with their interviews. So because of the information PwC provided, we brought along deputies from different offices to make sure that we had 2 in each home. We also knew that some of the workers might not be comfortable speaking to us in English, so we had some Tagalog-speaking deputies on site and others available via phone in case we needed some translation services. Next slide. We did have to bring a copy service because the owner said that they could not provide us with the documents requested. We made sure that we found a way to kind of circumvent that excuse. There were a lot of follow-up inspections. Our deputy did a great job collaborating with our state licensing agency to go out with them as well. And she provided a lot of updates to PwC. Also, PwC did a great job of referring any workers that came forward in the interim to us. We have a judgment enforcement unit that got involved very early, just in case there was any transferring of assets. We wanted to make sure that we could kind of hinder that. And then, as I mentioned, we did partner with our Department of Social Services so that if there were any licensing violations, those were addressed as well. Next slide. The audit, where PwC was crucial, is the timesheets were falsified. The workers were there for 24 hours straight, typically 6 days a week, but they were told to clock in for 6 hours each day. So they were only being paid for 6 hours of work. Because of that, we knew we couldn't rely on the records provided by the employer for the audit, so we needed testimony from employees. And PwC did an excellent job of arranging group meetings with workers and former workers, keeping them informed and notifying us and our deputies of what the actual working conditions were. So we were able to audit based on a 24-hour workday rather than the 6 that was reflected in the record.
And BOFE also sends out worker surveys, and we were able to help sit down with workers to fill them out because sometimes the language was stuff that they didn't necessarily understand correctly, so they would answer in a different way. So we're working together to, like, one, help evolve that language on the survey, but then also we were able to help them, like, really lay out what was actually happening by sitting down with them and doing it with them together.
Next slide, please. So I won't spend too much time on this. This is just a summary of what was cited. As you can see, a lot of minimum wage and overtime, and that was due greatly in part to the testimony provided to us. That way we were able to kind of prove up a case that they were working far longer than the 6-hour days that were reflected on their timesheets.
And just to say, I think we forgot to say, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the total was a little over 7 million, which was quite a bit.
And just to say, because I think we forgot to lay out at the beginning, so with this 24-hour shift, they were actually paying workers less than $3 an hour with no overtime, as low as $2.20 an hour, and there was 150 workers over the last 3 years that had actually worked for Adat Shalom, and there was just such a high turnover rate because the conditions and the compensation were so horrible.
And what I want to highlight is that as deputies, we had constantly expressed our frustration in attempting to prove a wage violation because it does rely so heavily on testimony rather than records. If an employer is not correctly logging hours, you're going to need workers to come forward and testify to what they actually worked. It's very hard for a government agent to get workers to trust you and to want to come along for this month-long, sometimes years-long process. And that's where PwC has been really instrumental in keeping them engaged, providing things other than just, enforcement opportunities. They have a real community tie, which we as investigators obviously don't have and can't provide. Next slide.
So then when we were after December 27th, when the citation was actually cited, after the new year, a media press release went out about the case, and PwC and also started getting calls. We forwarded it around also to our media contacts, and we were able to get a high level of visibility and coverage on this case. There was some bumps along the way because of the kind of bureaucratic processes that has to go through Labor Commissioner's office. We actually didn't see the actual press release until it was already released, which made it a little bit difficult. And as press started calling us, we also had to catch up and check in to see what was okay to talk about. So one thing that we worked out in this partnership was actually about how we could communicate, on a regular basis, and I think that's been key. And that we've been learning. This has been a whole learning process through every step of the way of kind of what to expect. And we on all sides, because we have this really great team where we have a foundation of knowing each other and built a foundation of trust, we could, even if there have been some bumps in the roads, we've been able to talk it through and overcome it. So here you see the Los Angeles Daily News, and we got the OC Register, some big cases, and we're hearing back from workers that in other facilities, things are facility owners are hearing about it, and they're starting to change some of the ways that they're doing things as well. So it's already having an impact on the industry. Next slide. So coming up, there's the owners did appeal the citation, and we are preparing for a hearing that will happen in May. So there are a lot more workers that have come out after the citation and the media releases. So we're working with them. We are helping them and supporting them as they're working with the labor commissioner's attorney to do the prep for the hearing, as well as starting to figure out and really do more training around who would like to be a spokesperson for the workers after the case is done as well. We are also working with judgment enforcement and collections, trying to get as much information together and have a strategy to try and make sure that that we are able to collect and money can go back into the pockets of the workers. We don't think that we necessarily will be able to get the whole $7 million, but the more information that we get now will make it a better possibility for that. And we are still working on new strategic cases. The workers who are a part of this case have also then come forward with other cases that when they've worked in other facilities as well. So we're really looking at how we're making an impact, not just with this one case, but what are the things that we're doing so that we have this goal of really changing the standard operating practices in the industry. And I think that's one of the greatest frameworks of this, both the collaboration, but the framework of industry change is what's key about these teams. Next slide. So as I just mentioned before, this has been a whole learning process. We kind of step by step don't necessarily know what to expect. So we've been able to establish the monthly team meetings, but then when we're actively on the case, we realize that we need to have weekly check-ins, and so that we can make sure that even if there's nothing to check in, we check in to make sure that we're not missing something, and so that we can make sure that PwC is also knows what's going on to best support in the most strategic way. Next slide. So some of our lessons learned is that one, doing the collaboration on the worker interviews and surveys is really important. First, that with the worker interview that we did with one of the key contacts that really opened up this case, she was really questioning and wavering whether she would actually do the interview, but she actually got support from another member of PwC to gain confidence to be able to go through with it. And again, with the surveys, it's just being there, even though a lot of Filipinos have English language ability, it's kind of translating some of the technical things as well as the cultural understanding so that we really get the correct and detailed information that we need for the case. It was really also key to have joint trainings together. So with Hina Shah, she did an overall industry study of residential care facilities that we all learned from, and then we shared our own experiences of our past experiences of enforcement in this area and learned from each other. And communication is key. As long as we're open and we're learning together and we're able to have ongoing regular communication, that's been key to really moving these cases forward and building a really strong team. Next slide.
Great. So thank you, Aki. This is Jennifer Lynn. I'm with the National Employment Law Project. I'm calling in from Berkeley, California, and I have the privilege of working both with Youngsun from the Labor Commissioner's Office and the 14 worker and community organizations that are part of this strategic enforcement partnership. I also get to sit in on some of the 7 industry-based strategy team meetings that were mentioned, and I convene monthly calls with the 14 community organizations from around the state to promote cross-learning. And finally, I get to work with some groups one-on-one to troubleshoot the sometimes complex state wage claims processes. In my previous life, I worked through a community organization to push cities here in the East Bay to enforce minimum wage, paid sick day, and fair scheduling policies. Here at NELP, we've been working to pass state and local minimum wage and other labor standards policies, and we know that without effective enforcement through community partnerships, the strongest laws on the books are not enough by themselves. As many of you listened to the presenters, maybe you thought, that's just California. They have the authority that my state doesn't have. Or, I'm a city with barely a handful of staff people. There's no way I can do what's being done there. Or maybe you're thinking the climate of immigration status related fear and intimidation, with that climate, workers are never going to feel confident and safe enough to file a claim against their employer. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask you for your indulgence in a quick exercise to envision the potential and to see why these partnerships are so important. I invite you to envision a workplace where previously a wage claim has been filed. Maybe it's someplace you yourself have investigated. Maybe it's a restaurant, a building where a janitor works, or a construction site. Now I want you to imagine that that work site has changed, that there's more of a culture of compliance with labor laws, in part because of a partnership with workers and worker organizations. There's been a noticeable shift at that work site. What do you imagine that you see at that work site from the workers, from the manager and employer? What does it feel like? How do you know that this is a work site where instead of wage theft, we have wage justice? For me, I see a lightness in the mood or laughter from the workers. I walked through that very quickly, but our not so small challenge is to figure out together how we make that image of wage justice a reality. For NELP and the agencies and the groups that we work with, this type of strategic enforcement partnership is absolutely critical to making these laws real, to ensuring both workers get real dollars in their pockets and governments help create a more level playing field for businesses. In the California partnership, we have groups across the spectrum. Some, like in the janitorial team, have spent years navigating the public agency wage claims process. They know the ins and outs. They can explain the hearing and investigation process to workers. And these groups have figured out the puzzle pieces of leveraging state and local enforcement to complement each other. They are our mentors, our guides. They help train the other groups. We also have community groups who are earlier in their partnership relationship. They've had very little or maybe negative experiences working with government agencies in the past. They're still figuring out how to leverage this partnership, and they're weighing the advantage of this agency's wage claim process versus other legal or organizing strategies. But even in the sectors that are still building, it's clear that the workers and worker organizations know how the industry is changing, how employers are reacting to new laws and regulations, and how the agency and the community together can be nimble and responsive to this changing sectoral landscape. Because the reality is, even with the strictest anti-wage theft laws on the books, unscrupulous employers seem to find a way around the law. And that's why we need all of us, states, localities, local organizations and workers, supportive businesses and coalition groups coming together to build the network and the strategic partnerships necessary to move the needle on wage theft. So I invite you to please check out NELP's website, and I'll turn it over to Pranitha for questions.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thank you very much to the presenters. So we now want to hear from you. We just sent instructions again to type in any questions you may have. So the first question I want to ask, actually either to Aki or to Emily, is, how has the partnership responded to the heightened threats of retaliation, whether immigration-based or otherwise?
I can go first. That's definitely been something that has been on our radar at the Labor Commissioner's Office. We have received a lot more feedback from workers that they are being directly or indirectly threatened with deportation or being reported to immigration. So what our Labor Commissioner has done is really stepped up our retaliation complaint unit. They have received special training in immigration retaliation. We have a fast track system now. So if we are conducting a field investigation and we receive word either from a community partner or the worker themselves that they're being threatened or intimidated, we immediately involve our retaliation unit We also have a separate case we're working on where we've involved our local district attorney. So, I mean, luckily in California, we do have some legislation that supports us in that effort. But Aki might be able to speak from a community partner perspective on that.
Great. Thank you, Aki.
I think her phone might have cut out.
Aki, are you muted? Okay, well, let me move along because I know people have questions. What is the scope of the authority of the California Community Licensing with regards to revoking the agency's licenses? And this is a question from Rocio Avila.
That is actually a very good question. We do have a labor code that refers specifically to that. So if an employer who owns several homes is found to owe wages and a judgment is entered, community care licensing can revoke that person's license. We've noticed a lot of these licensees now who have multiple locations will get licenses in different names. They'll set up a bunch of shell corporations, one for each location, so that if their license is revoked at one, they can continue operating at the others. But what we've tried to do is start to cultivate a relationship with licensing, point out to them that workers being treated well, in essence, does affect patient care, which is their main priority over at licensing. So we've tried to kind of work together with them and find a creative way to prevent employers who should not be operating from finding different ways to, open care homes under other names. But they do have that authority. I know that they are not excited about using it because it does involve finding alternative accommodations for all of those residents. But I think we've been making some inroads in that respect.
Thank you. So I have a question on measuring success in the partnership. Jenny, can you speak to how you measure success and what that looks like, what that means?
Sure. So I think there's lots of ways to think about measuring success, and folks talked in the case study about how this one particular case, not only does it have a high number of workers and a high citation value in terms of $7 million, but it's also having a ripple effect in the industry itself. Aki mentioned that some of the other residential care facilities are starting to take notice. In the job announcements she's mentioned in the past, that they are now advertising at minimum wage, being more explicit about that. So I think one measure of success is not only about the number of workers or number of dollars won for workers or the number of cases that are taken on, but also what is that, as Janice mentioned, the industry ripple effect. What is happening for other employers and other work sites in that particular industry? And I think for the CBOs in particular, that is one measure of success. I think for a lot of the community-based organizations, it's also a measure of success to see how word is getting around. Are more workers more willing to step forward? Are they seeing that other workers are stepping forward and feel a sense of camaraderie and solidarity, that it's not so alone for them as one worker alone to step forward. And I think Aki has mentioned in the past also that this case grew momentum as it went along, that more workers heard about this case, they were more comfortable in stepping forward. So I think there are multiple ways to measure success, both from the case side, from the worker side, from the agency side, as well as the community organizations.
Thanks so much, Jenny. Youngsun, do you have any thoughts about the measuring success from the agency side?
Yes, I would just say that some of the more traditional criteria internally, obviously would be things like the dollar figures and number of workers, but we're also very focused on measuring kind of the internal capacity that we're developing to be more strategic. And so recently we've been given more funding to increase our field enforcement staff, and that was really justified through the justification of the strategic enforcement model. And so I think that's one measure of success, is really showing that even if we have a smaller caseload, that we're getting greater impact from concentrating the resources in these higher impact cases.
Thank you very much. So I have a question. Were any workers granted a U visa?
Not currently. I know that PwC has been working with Asian Americans Advancing Justice and their attorneys to explore that, but as far as I know, we haven't had any granted.
Thank you. So this type of strategic enforcement partnership is very resource intensive versus just a complaint-based enforcement strategy. How is this partnership resourced? And I know, Youngsun, you started talking about this at the beginning. Could you say more?
Okay, well, yes, in the beginning I mentioned that the organizations, many of them have direct private funding for this work as it fits into their broader organizational missions. They have funding that assists them in supporting public enforcement and working with agencies both at local and statewide levels. And so we're benefiting from that, because that means that in turn, we have partners on the other side who have more time and resources and skills and training to be able to partner effectively with us on these cases. And we're not starting from step one. They've already been well versed in our procedures and are skilled and experienced. So that private funding plays a critical role. And internally, it's really been a matter of prioritizing these cases. And we're still this work falls directly in line with our organizational mission. So I wouldn't say we've had to divert any resources to this work. It's really been, for us, more a matter of an organizational culture that we're cultivating, that really, so that staff understand the value of the partnership and know how to navigate these cases in partnership with these groups. So in terms of resources, we have really prioritized these cases, and we've benefited from that private funding as well, because it funds travel and meetings and relationship building opportunities. But I would say that it's really been more a matter of prioritization versus any kind of new resources that has either made or broken the opportunity.
Hi, everyone. So this is Janice Fine. First, I want to thank so much the awesome California team for sharing this very inspiring experience with us. And I also want to say that for all of those agencies, as Jenny was saying earlier, what we're really hoping you take out of this is not just, that if you can't do the Cadillac version of co-enforcement, strategic co-enforcement, that there's so much you can do in terms of building relationships with key organizations, sharing information, working together to identify strategic cases, and working together over the course of cases. There's, so many examples of where agencies and organizations can really make a difference. In Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles County and City, there is public funding that's going to these partnerships, and there are equally inspiring stories of incredibly important cases that have been brought through these partnerships. So we want to thank you very, very much. On behalf of Pronita Gupta from CLASP and myself from the Center for Innovation and Worker Organization at Rutgers, we will talk to you soon. We'll announce to you soon what the next call will be. We want to really encourage you to follow up with us if you have specific ideas for future webinars. And we hope that your work is going well, and want you to know how much we respect the great work that agencies and organizations that are on this call are doing every single day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.